Have you ever picked up a stranger in the dead of night, thinking you were doing a good deed? I did, and I'll never do it again. It was past midnight and the rain was relentless, turning the highway into a glistening ribbon of despair. My rig's headlights barely cut through the curtain of water as I rumbled along the deserted stretch of Route 86. That's when I saw her. A figure soaked to the bone, standing at the edge of the road, arm outstretched, thumb up. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about her stopped me. Maybe it was the desperation in her stance, or the storm, or just my own loneliness. I pulled over. She climbed in silently, her wet hair clinging to her face like dark vines. She shivered, but didn't speak. I offered her a towel from the back. She took it without meeting my eyes. "Where are you headed?" I asked, breaking the silence. "South," she said, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. I nodded and kept driving. For a while, we sat in silence, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the wipers the only sounds. But then I noticed something odd in the reflection of my rearview mirror. She wasn't shivering anymore. In fact, she seemed completely dry. I stole a glance at her. Her clothes were still damp, but her skin was wrong. Too pale, almost translucent. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She turned to me then, her face partially illuminated by the dashboard's glow. Her eyes weren't human, they were pools of black, endless and cold. Her lips parted, revealing teeth far too sharp for comfort. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered. The rig lurched, the dashboard lights flickered, and suddenly the air grew freezing. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder. When I turned to face her, the passenger seat was empty, water pooling where she'd sat. I jumped out of the cab, flashlight in hand, but there was no sign of her. Not on the road, not in the rain, not anywhere. Only an overwhelming sense of dread lingered, like a hand gripping my throat. When I climbed back into the truck, I found a message scrawled in the condensation on the windshield. "You'll see me again." I quit trucking the next day, but every time it rains, I feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. Have you ever felt like the force was listening? That's how I felt, the night I camped in Black Hollow. The locals warned me not to go. They said the woods were cursed, alive in ways they couldn't explain. But I laughed it off. I was a seasoned hiker and camper. Superstitions didn't scare me. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-red hues. As darkness settled, the forest came alive with its usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves. It wasn't until I built my fire that the quiet started. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the woods. The crickets stopped. The wind stilled. Even the crackling of my fire seemed muffled. I brushed it off as nerves, but then I saw them. Shadows, moving just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought they were animals, deer or coyotes maybe, but these shapes didn't move like animals. They moved like people, deliberate, watching. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence like a shattering mirror. No answer, just the sound of something brushing against the trees. I stayed close to the fire, clutching a knife from my pack. I told myself it was my imagination, but the shadows kept circling. And then they stopped, all at once. The silence deepened, oppressive. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, repeating my name. Mark. I froze, the knife slipping from my grip. The whisper grew louder, closer, until it surrounded me. Mark, you shouldn't be here. I bolted, leaving my gear behind. The forest seemed to twist around me, trees shifting like they wanted to trap me. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. When I finally broke free of the woods, I collapsed on the road, gasping for air. I glanced back and saw nothing. No shadows. No movement, just the stillness of the forest. The next morning, I returned with a search party to retrieve my belongings, but my campsite was gone. No fire pit, no tent, just undisturbed forest floor. I don't camp anymore and I avoid Black Hollow, but sometimes on quiet nights, I hear my name whispered on the wind. Have you ever felt watched when no one was around? That was the feeling I had the night I took a shortcut through the old cornfield. The town called it Devil's Acre, a name whispered with unease by anyone who had lived here long enough. I never believed in the stories. Until that night. The moon was high, its pale light casting long shadows over the rows of corn, swaying gently in the breeze. It should have been peaceful, but the silence between the rustling stalks felt heavy, unnatural. About halfway through the field, I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, like wind brushing through dry leaves. But it wasn't the wind. The voice carried words, soft and serpentine. Turn back. I froze. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as the whispering grew louder, coming from all around me. Dozens of voices, overlapping, repeating, turn back. I told myself it was my imagination. That's what I kept thinking as I pushed forward, flashlight clutched tightly in my trembling hand. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, louder with every step. Then I saw it. Just ahead in the moonlight, a scarecrow. Its head was a sack, with hollow eyes and a crude stitched mouth. It wasn't there when I entered. I stepped closer, drawn by some morbid curiosity. The whispers stopped, leaving a suffocating silence. I reached out with a shaking hand, but before I could touch it, the scarecrow's head turned sharply to face me. It rasped, the single word leaving its stitched mouth. I bolted, weaving through the rows as the whispers returned, louder than before. The stalk seemed alive, clawing at me, slowing me down. Behind me, heavy footsteps pounded the earth, chasing, closing in. When I burst out of the field, gasping for air, everything went still. I turned back, expecting to see someone or something emerge, but the corn stood undisturbed, silent under the moon. I've never gone near Devil's Acre again, but I hear whispers sometimes when I drive past, soft and serpentine, telling me to come back. Have you ever caught your reflection doing something you didn't? That's what happened the night I stayed at the old Hopper Inn. The place was ancient, its creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper speaking of long-forgotten years. I was on a business trip and needed a place to stay. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a wary smile, handed me the key to room 13. She hesitated before saying, "Keep the mirror covered." The room was small but cozy, save for the ornate full-length mirror standing in the corner. Its silver frame was tarnished, and intricate carvings of faces, distorted and anguished, ran along the edges. A heavy black cloth hung over it. I laughed off the innkeeper's warning, pulling the cloth aside to reveal the mirror. It was just a mirror, or so I thought. As I unpacked my suitcase, I glanced at my reflection. It stared back, mimicking my every move. Until it didn't. I froze. My reflection didn't match my movements. When I leaned forward, it leaned back. When I raised my left hand, it raised its right. My chest tightened as my reflection grinned. A slow, malicious grin that I wasn't wearing. Its eyes seemed darker, emptier. I stumbled back, bumping into the bed. My reflection stepped closer to the glass, pressing its hands against it as if testing its boundaries. "Let me out," it whispered, though my lips didn't move. I grabbed the cloth and threw it over the mirror. Heart pounding. The room felt colder, like something had seeped into it. I tried to sleep, but the whispering didn't stop. Faint and insistent. "Let me out." By morning, I'd fled the inn without a word, but every mirror since has made me uneasy. Sometimes, I think I see that grin, waiting for me to slip. Have you ever heard a house breathe? Not creak or groan like old wood, but actually breathe. I never believed it was possible until I stayed in the manor on Hollow Ridge. It started as a dare. My friends bet I wouldn't last a night in the place. Everyone in town avoided. The manor had been abandoned for decades, but locals whispered about strange noises, lights in the windows, even figures moving behind the curtains. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like the house was alive. My flashlight swept over decaying furniture, peeling wallpaper, and floors coated in dust thick enough to muffle my footsteps. I set up my sleeping bag in the grand living room, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle from upstairs. Rats. I told myself. It wasn't until midnight that I heard it. A low hum, faint and rhythmic. It wasn't mechanical or melodic. It was organic, like the sound of something exhaling. I froze, straining to pinpoint the source. The hum came from the walls, vibrating just beneath the surface. It grew louder, turning into a guttural groan that made the floorboards tremble. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The hum stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse. Then I saw it. The wallpaper near the far wall began to bulge outward, like something was pushing from the other side. It wasn't human. Its shape-shifting and writhing as it pressed against the fragile barrier. "Run," the thought screamed in my head, but my legs wouldn't move. The bulge grew larger, stretching the wall until it began to crack. Splinters of wood fell to the floor as a gaping hole formed. A hand? No, not a hand. Something with too many fingers reached through, clawing at the air. Its surface shimmered like it wasn't entirely real. The hum returned, deafening now, filling my head with static and fear. Somehow, I managed to stumble back, racing out the front door without looking behind me. When I reached the safety of the road, the house was silent again. The bulging wall was gone. The cracks vanished, like it had been waiting for me to come back. I didn't take the dare money, but I know one thing. That house wasn't abandoned. Have you ever boarded a train you didn't remember buying a ticket for? That's exactly what happened to me. And I wish I could forget. It was late. I just left work after pulling a double shift. The subway station was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo like a scream. When the train pulled in, it wasn't one I recognized. The cars were old, far older than anything that should have been running. The paint was faded, and the windows were too grimy to see inside. Still, I was too tired to care. And when the doors slid open, I stepped on board. Inside, the train smelled of damp earth and rust. The seats were lined with faded red velvet, and the dim lights flickered in time with the train's rattling motion. I was alone, or so I thought. I sat down and closed my eyes, hoping to catch a few minutes of rest. But the sound of footsteps jolted me awake. Across the aisle sat a man, or something that looked like a man. He was dressed in a tattered suit, his skin pale and stretched too tightly over his bones. His eyes were dark, empty, and he stared at me without blinking. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Home," I replied, though the word felt hollow. He smiled, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. "No one gets off this train." I jumped to my feet, panic surging through me. The doors at either end of the car were gone, replaced by solid walls of corroded metal. The lights flickered more violently now, casting his skeletal frame into horrifying relief. The train picked up speed, faster and faster, until the windows showed nothing but a blur of darkness. The man stood, his movements jerky and unnatural. I ran, racing through the cars. Each one was the same, empty seats and flickering lights. But then the passengers appeared. They sat slumped in their seats, their faces frozen in expressions of fear or agony. Their eyes followed me as I passed, but their bodies didn't move. The whispering started then, low and guttural. "You can't leave." I don't know how I did it, but I found a way. I slammed my fist into one of the windows until it shattered. The rushing wind pulled me through, and I landed hard on the cold concrete of the station platform. When I turned around, the train was gone. No screech of brakes, no lights fading into the tunnel, just silence. I never take the subway anymore, but sometimes, when I'm near the station, I hear it. The hum of a train that shouldn't exist. Have you ever followed a voice, even though you knew it was wrong? It was supposed to be a simple job, a weekend getaway. I needed time alone to clear my head, so when I found an ad for a caretaker's position at an old lighthouse on the coast, I jumped at the chance. The lighthouse was isolated, perched on a cliff overlooking a churning sea, far from the nearest town, perfect for some peace and solitude. The first night was peaceful enough. The wind howled through the cracks of the stone walls, and the waves below crashed violently against the rocks. But then, around midnight, I heard it, a lost, soft at first, almost a whisper, coming from the lighthouse's upper tower. I told myself it was the wind. The house creaked, and maybe it was just an old building settling, but the voice grew clearer. "Help me." I froze, my blood turning cold. The voice sounded desperate, panicked. I climbed the spiral staircase to the top of the tower, heart pounding in my chest. The door to the lantern room creaked open, and I stepped into the dimly lit space. There was no one there, just the empty room, the huge light that swept the dark waters below. I almost laughed at myself, shaking my head. Maybe I had imagined it. But then I noticed the notebook on the desk. It was old, its pages yellowed and fragile. But one page was marked with a message. "The lighthouse is alive. It calls to you. It wants you to stay." The chill in my bones returned as I looked out at the dark sea. That's when I heard the voice again, louder this time. "Don't leave." I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one, just the creeping shadows. The lighthouse. It was alive, as the note said. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound of the ocean below, as if the building itself was breathing, waiting. I tried to leave. I rushed down the stairs and grabbed my bag, heading for the door, but when I reached it, the door wouldn't open. The air thickened, and the voice grew stronger. "Stay with us." The walls groaned like a living thing. I backed away, panic rising in my chest. The lighthouse was no longer just a building. It was something else. Something ancient. I don't know how I got out, or how I made it back to the town, but I remember one thing clearly. As I walked away from the lighthouse, I heard the last whisper. "You'll be back." I never went back, but every time I pass a lighthouse now, I can feel the pull, and I wonder if the voice will call again. Have you ever heard of a place that doesn't appear on any map? A town that vanishes every few decades? Wren's Hollow wasn't supposed to exist. That's what I told myself when I first heard about it. I was working on an investigative piece for a local magazine, researching forgotten places and ghost towns, when I came across a mention of Wren's Hollow, a town that had been completely abandoned, every building empty, except for a handful of eerie, unexplained disappearances. I decided to check it out, to see for myself if there was any truth to the whispers I'd heard. The locals didn't like talking about it, but I managed to find an old man in a nearby village who knew the story. "Wren's Hollow?" he said, shaking his head. "It appears once every 70 years, people go in, but they don't come out." I was intrigued and skeptical. The man spoke in riddles, his eyes darting nervously. He said it was the curse of the Wren family, descendants of an old witch who had sealed her town's fate by dabbling in forbidden magic. Every generation, a new batch of people would vanish from the town, drawn there by something they couldn't understand. So I set out, with my camera and notebook, determined to get to the bottom of this strange tale. The road leading into Wren's Hollow was overgrown with weeds, the air heavy with a sense of isolation. As I drove closer to the town, I felt a chill, a deep, unnatural cold that made my skin crawl. When I arrived, the town seemed frozen in time. The houses looked like they had been abandoned for decades, yet there were no signs of decay. It was as if the place had been left in a hurry, Yet nothing had rotted or deteriorated. I walked down the cobblestone streets, hearing nothing but the wind and my own footsteps. The air smelled stale, like something hadn't moved in years. But there was something else, something unsettling. I saw figures, standing motionless in the windows, faces staring out from behind dusty glass. I called out, hoping someone would answer, but no one did. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then, I felt it. A tug, a pull, like something was guiding me deeper into the town. My steps quickened, and before I knew it, I found myself in the center of the town square, where a grand clock tower stood. The hands of the clock were frozen at midnight. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, faint at first, then clearer. "You shouldn't have come." I turned, but there was no one there. The sound of footsteps echoed in the street behind me. I ran, panic surging in my chest. But the more I ran, the more the town seemed to shift. Doors opened that weren't there before. Paths twisted in on themselves. That was the last thing I remember clearly. I woke up on the outskirts of the town, my camera gone, my notes shredded, and I've never spoken about it again. The story of Wren's Hollow isn't over. It's still out there, waiting for the next person to stumble into its trap, and when the clock strikes midnight, you'll be drawn to it too.